I had a very strange and disturbing dream last night, Connie.
Am I going to hear about it?
Yeah. So I dreamt that I'm sitting in an exam. It was an engineering exam. I knew the concept very well. I was surprised how I remember that. I kind of had some perception of the time that this is from the past and like I'm supposed to be forgetting already like what's going on. And the exam was timed and I had so much struggle to solve it. I was just paralyzed. And when I woke up, I realized that those senses, those kind of like the showing of that kind of like nervousness in that moment is still like super fresh in my subconscious. So that was the way I started my day today. So on that positive note,
Yeah.
hello. Welcome to SquarePeg's podcast, where we share first-hand experience of neurodiverse graduate students and faculty members. I'm Arash Zaghi. Today, my guest is Connie Syharat. She's a PhD student in the School of Education at the University of Connecticut. Give it a listen. Thank you very much for accepting this invitation and agreeing to do this podcast. For a long time, I was hoping that we can do this at the right time because your insight, your experience from the work that you're doing, the research that you're doing, your personal experience and your interactions with so many students in the past few years is putting you in a very unique position actually to share your understanding and knowledge and experience with a broader audience. So I appreciate that you accepted this today.
Thanks. Happy to be here.
Let's start with a little bit of background history. Tell us about the history of your involvement in this effort.
I started working with you on, I believe it was during your REU project, the first one for students with ADHD. And I came in doing some support on that project, learning a lot, doing some observations. I think I was still kind of in the middle of that process of like doing the paradigm shift because I had read your proposal and was getting familiar with the idea of neurodiversity as a strength versus that deficit mindset that I had come in with, I think, as a former teacher. So when I think back to that time, I'm really think of it as a kind of a transformative moment for me where all of a sudden I was like, oh, I can look at this completely differently and make a completely different meaning out of the same exact circumstance. Mm-hmm. Eventually started collecting some data for a different research project of yours and related to creativity and engineering and really plowing through some of the mechanics of learning how to do research from a practical standpoint and still learning a lot at that point.
You spent some time, I remember, diving deep and reviewing that literature, and then you started interacting with students. Can you differentiate kind of like how each experience, intellectually analyzing what's out there, and first-hand experience of working with students with ADHD or other neurodiverse students, how different it was for you at that time?
So I think for me, there was a difference in that the way that the research environment was set up and the culture that you and the team had set up, really providing a huge amount of flexibility for the students to be who they were and to follow their natural drive to explore and create freely without all the limitations that are typical to a classroom. I think it opened the door for that element of surprise and wonder and kind of more just stepping back and saying, what could this student do, or what could they make, or what could they find, what could they explore if I didn't, as a teacher, set all of those limits. So that was different. I think my first experiences with that, I think it helped me recognize that we as educators like have a lot of limitations, and a lot of that is what we bring into the classroom of our own and how we structure activities to meet certain learning outcomes, right? We're pressured to create things in a certain way that lead to a certain defined end in some way, shape, or form. Yeah. The structure was so open and so free, it just allowed for so much more possibility. And if teachers could recognize their own box.
But there are students now that they're stuck in that kind of traditional system of education, and they don't feel comfortable having a conversation with the teacher. The teacher is not necessarily open to changing their strategies. What would be, is that student doomed to failure?
I think the answer is it depends on the environment. Just looking at family experiences. Some years it was a great experience, some years it was awful. And it was really shaped by the teacher, how they kind of like reacted to them as learners in the classroom. So, I mean, from the student perspective, if you're in that kind of a rigid situation, how do you advocate for more exploration if there's no exploration built in? There's often a way to bring in interests or talents that can make things bearable, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And I've seen a lot of students, they find something that can help them bring their whole self to the classroom. They're just like their own reading. That's what I used to do. I mean, finding another textbook, another like source that is more fun for me to engage with during classes.
But bearable is not really the goal, right?
Yeah.
That's still pretty miserable.
Yeah. I hear you. So, Connie, we want to talk about your recent paper. It's an NSF-funded project that through that we are exploring the experiences of neurodiverse graduate students in STEM. So why don't you start by telling us about the 3 themes that emerged from the analysis of the data?
Sure. So essentially, we found 3 major themes that kind of interlock: the internalization of neurotypical norms, self-silencing to make it through grad school, and neurodivergent burnout due to overwork and masking. So the goal of the research, I think, was really to uncover some of the experiences of neurodiverse students in grad STEM programs. It's an area that hasn't seen a lot of research, and most of the research that has been done has focused on undergraduate students or has really come at it from a disability perspective or a deficit-based perspective, which is different from what we're doing. You know, our perspective is really that neurodiversity is something that adds value to, you know, help human societies flourish and tackle challenging problems. And so we know that there are a lot of challenges in grad school for everyone. Mental health is a huge concern for everyone.
Yeah.
There's a lot of stress. There's a lot of new things to learn. And I think the question was, are there unique experiences that people have who are neurodiverse? We had a series of 10 focus groups. They were conducted during COVID, so everything was done online. It was interesting because I think everyone had kind of gone through a period of isolation and was really welcoming interaction with other students in any form. We heard a lot of people say, well, I started during COVID, and so I didn't really meet anyone in my program. So it was interesting that the fact we had focus groups allowed students to meet each other. And I think it really reduced isolation, kind of that sense of like being alone and struggling on your own through something. There was a lot of kind of camaraderie, and people really enjoyed the conversations. And
you personally ran the focus groups. What was your impression watching their interactions, from body language all the way to what they discussed in terms of, were they surprised by the level of similarity of the experiences? Were they hesitant at all to discuss their experiences during your focus group conversations?
So, I mean, it varied obviously from group to group, and the mix of personalities and how people identified in terms of, you know, ADHD or autism or anxiety or whatever it was that they had reported. But, you know, some groups really connected. People didn't hesitate to share what they were going through, both positive and negative. People were very honest. There was a lot of informal, comfortable conversation, people just sharing details about their life. And I don't know, it was comfortable.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that experience was a positive one for them, or it was more of like reminding them of the challenges and difficulties?
It was very well received. People really enjoyed it. And we had a lot of people at the end of the groups just say, you know, that they enjoyed talking to people, that they felt like they learned from each other. They were really happy we were doing the research and said thank you for doing it.
Mm-hmm. One thing we have noticed over and over is that if we don't facilitate conversations like this, it may not happen organically. And the outcome of that is that each student is going to internalize those challenges. Is going to assume that it's only me experiencing that because of certain challenges I have, rather than thinking more broadly about some systemic problems or accepting that some of them are just the nature of the beast. I mean, like I'm happy that you say that they had a positive impression participating in this study. So now let's go to some of the major findings. How about you tell us about the major themes that emerged after you processed the data?
Basically, what we found were three major themes. The first one that was pretty clear was that people were internalizing the norms of grad school. This is like pressure to be neurotypical, essentially, to behave a certain way, to process information a certain way, to communicate a certain way, to complete your work in a certain way at a certain time, on a certain schedule, to be able to take on huge amounts of things and stay organized and meet all of your deadlines, to not be perceived as struggling in any way. So there was a lot of feeling like there's an expectation I should be a certain way, and I'm just not like that. And if I show that to anyone, then there will be consequences, right? Whether it be losing a position on a project or funding, or maybe I don't get that recommendation from that faculty member. Maybe it's just like I'm perceived as not as competent for some reason. So there are a lot of, real reasons that people are worried about this, but essentially the internalizing of these norms is just resulting in a lot of stress and adds the pressure to mask neurodiversity, which is really like something that's in the conversation around autism primarily, but has become a little bit more kind of widely used recently in the ADHD community as well.
So do you think those norms, those expectations are ideas that students they have formed or they're explicitly told you have to act this way, or a combination of both?
I mean, it's all around you, right? It's what people show each other. I think some of it is explicitly told. I think some of it is prior experiences building up and having negative experiences in the past. I think a lot of it comes down from the structures that are built into the system and like even things like the funding agency schedule, right? And the fact that, your faculty advisor needs to produce some sort of result in a certain time frame in order to continue looking like a productive researcher, right? So there's pressure coming down from a bunch of different levels where if you're missing a deadline or your work is taking a longer time than someone thinks it should, right? Or maybe you want to explore something different and you're not progressing on like this one particular thing at the pace that's expected, right? The sense is that there's this like structure above you that's going to come down on you.
And that's actually an important point. So we cannot only blame advisors for being too regimented probably about how the research is performed and the timeline of that. Some of that is dictated from the above. I know we have very descriptive quotes on the paper. Why don't you read some of those that you think they clearly tell the story, encapsulate the challenge?
Sure. So I think one that seems pretty representative of this feeling of just internalizing, like I'm not meeting the expectations or I'm not like everyone else, is from someone we're calling Robin. And Robin identified as having ADHD, anxiety, depression, and PTSD. And Robin said, yeah, I think the main thing that I struggle with is the self-deprecation and the comparison, because I work in an office with a lot of neurotypicals who just like can write and ponder about these things all day and like don't ever shut off. So listening to these people and be like, why can't I be like them? Why can't I be like them? Why can't I be like them? And I'm like, I'm lucky if I get one good day a week, let alone a month, where I can do something partially similar to what they're doing. And then I just noticed also a lot of people describing kind of how they work and then putting in kind of a negative self-judgment at the same time. There was a lot of talk about procrastination, like great conversations about procrastinating on writing, especially. Someone named Moira She says, I tell myself whenever I procrastinate or whenever I'm like doing something late at night, like at the last minute, and like it always gets done. I don't know how, but it always gets done. I've never handed anything in late, but so it must be working, which is just really not a healthy mentality to have, but like it gets finished. You know, there's a lot around this procrastination stuff where even if you look at the literature around procrastination, it's all described as maladaptive and unhealthy and generally bad. Whereas the participants in this study, when they talked about their procrastination, they described it as unhealthy, but kind of as an afterthought. And they mostly talked about it as like magic, like the magic that helps me get things done.
Can you explain
So
more?
So here's another quote. Wendy says, "But yeah, I do not do anything until the very last minute ever. And then I just panic about it. And then it magically gets done. I haven't figured out what the magic part is yet." There's a sense of using procrastination as a tool. I feel like there's kind of this sense of like, it works for me. I do it. That's how I do things. It's magic. It gets things done. But then also like, but I kind of feel bad about it because I think it's probably unhealthy.
That's very interesting. I hear that lack of self-acceptance, right? I mean, like, so you're told that procrastination is bad. You go with that assumption. Everyone says procrastination is bad, and yet it's working for you, but you cannot forgive yourself for using it. That conflict, actually, that tells a lot about like this kind of challenge we have internally. Things that we know work for us and things that the society tells us should be a certain way, and always this conflict. So that's very interesting. Procrastination actually is a sticky one.
Yeah.
Because if you ask around, like probably 99 people out of 100, they will tell you procrastination is bad, get rid of it. There is nothing good about it. But yet we are seeing students deep down thinking that that is something that they're using as an asset. But they still blame themselves for using it. And I know you're aware of some literature that they suggest that procrastination actually could be an asset. So do you want to allude to that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, so there is some literature that talks about procrastination, but as a positive, but they actually kind of call it something different. They say, you know, if you're using it on purpose, it's called purposive delay. So even in that kind of
what do they can you explain?
What they mean is like putting it off on purpose until I've had a chance to work out the details on this particular thing, or think this through more, or you know, make sure that the situation is in the right spot to get the work done. Like it's a purposeful thing.
Is it purposeful and intentional? Because I've found myself doing it unintentionally, like delaying initiating a task just because subconsciously I'm aware I'm not ready to tackle that yet. If you ask me like what you need for you to be ready to do that, I may not be able to give you a list of things that I'm waiting for me to kind of the idea to form in my head. Particularly, it happens a lot when I have to write something. And then suddenly I feel ready and then I start writing. But I still blame myself that like, oh, I should have started a week earlier. I mean, yet I know that the material wasn't there, you know, the subconscious. So that's why I'm saying like, is it purposeful and intentional, or purposeful but not intentional?
And I'm not sure. I'm not sure I can answer that, but it reminded me of another quote, and I'm remembering it, so I'm not going to remember the whole thing, but I know Wendy also said, you know, she was beating herself up for not being able to work in regimented time and describing sitting down to try and write, and it's not happening. And it's not happening, and it's not happening, and so finally you just stop and put it off, and then eventually it happens, right? But there's a sense of like, you're really sometimes feel like you're wasting your time if you start earlier because you're not in the right mental space to do it. And it's going to take extra time because you're not focused in on the task in the way that's going to be productive until it's that moment when you need to do it.
How's your experience as a neurodiverse person, Connie?
With procrastination? Yeah.
You're a good writer, particularly. I mean, procrastination in writing. Because I've noticed that sometimes you do that, and I've come to this full realization that like it just gets done at the right time. Not for me, based on my schedule, when you're ready to tackle that. So I want to see like What goes on internally?
I have done this for forever. And I think this is one of the differences between high school and undergrad and then grad school writing is that at the high school level and the undergrad level, to some extent, you can do things faster because there's the level of depth and the demand is not the same.
Yeah.
So I've always done that through my whole life. I've written entire papers, finding my first source to the very end in like an 8-hour, time frame. Obviously, I can't do that anymore. That doesn't work. But I still feel like there's a level of real urgency and pressure that has to be there in order for things to really take off.
From outside, not internally. That urgency is not internal, or is it?
Sometimes it's both.
So would deadlines help?
So we had this conversation a lot, actually, in the focus groups about deadlines and fake deadlines. And
Tell us about that.
And the conversation, there were about five people with ADHD having this conversation, talking about having their advisor assign them fake deadlines. Mm-hmm. And the one clear thing was you can't know it's a fake deadline.
Yeah.
If you know it's a fake deadline, it's not going to work. So I guess in terms of just making up deadlines, I'm not sure.
Again, like that's my personal experience. It's not based on the data. If I know it's fake, I do not adhere to that. It should be genuinely urgent and critical and matter of death and life for me to spend the bandwidth.
Everyone tells you should just reward yourself with a gummy bear or something after every paragraph. And they're like, I don't control this. Like, I'm just going to eat the gummy bear.
All of these self-help books that they are giving this like dysfunctional strategies. And sometimes it can be confusing. So this is something that I've been thinking about very recently, that some of these self-help books, they may generate a delusion that you're in control and you can fix that. And yet, I've tried so many of these strategies at so many points in my life and I failed. And every time I fail is another scar, essentially, that here I go, not being able to adhere to something, another strategy or something, and yet other people are using it and they're flourishing, they're thriving, and I failed again. I'm not sure, honestly, if these self-help books, like 11 ways of doing this or that, or like 5 strategies to be able to address this problem or that, if their impact is net positive or negative. I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
Yeah, I don't know if I can say anything about the self-help books, really. One of the things that I've been thinking about for a while is the canned wisdom that we get handed to us by the support centers and the strategy centers, where they're trying to help people not procrastinate and manage their time better and set goals and things like that. And I think those strategies might work for a lot of people. I also know that a lot of them don't work for me. Mm-hmm. And I feel like there's some fine tuning to be done on those things. So like, rather than don't procrastinate, I would say fine tune your procrastination. Like, can you reset your alarm to a little bit earlier, because you know that, like, if you're working with faculty who's really busy, or you're working with, the department head who's extra busy, they don't have the same flexibility in their schedule to like do your paper revision at the last minute. So then it is actually an emergency to start maybe a week earlier, because you are going to run into some serious interpersonal kind of like drama if you're doing things on a schedule that works for you, but it doesn't work for your team, right? Can you
what do you
can
call
you like
this?
recalibrate yourself a little bit?
That is very interesting, and I think that's very useful. What do you call this? Is it forming a realistic understanding of the situation, or more knowledge, or a better communication? It seems you're there. You have gained that wisdom, essentially. And what was the process of gaining that? How can you give it like a
I think I learned it from experience, just working with people who are so much busier than I am, and having to figure out that, like, it's not ideal for the team. it may be ideal for me and my internal process to like work later. And so I just had to kind of like reset the conditions that like triggered my process to start a little bit. But I also feel like I have some level of trust with my team where they have seen me get things done. And so maybe don't panic quite as much if I'm running closer to the deadline.
That's where communication comes.
So there has to be some level of trust and communication, but then also like evaluation of what's the actual scenario. It's not just me anymore at a grad student level. It's a team of people who all have different needs, right? So it's recalibrating to everyone else's kind of reality too.
Yeah. Do you think if I'm putting my advisor hat and asking this question, rather than just telling my student, for example, that I need this draft by Friday, I build more context around it, that like I need it by then so I can spend like a day or two working on it, or like my schedule looks like and it needs to be out on Tuesday. So that's, for example, like, do you think that piece of information helps, or it may help some people, they may not help? For me, context is important for me to realize that I'm part of this team rather than like a tool, you know?
I think awareness of the schedule especially might be helpful. Not everyone necessarily has access to their advisor's full schedule, right? So they may not have a sense of like, oh, they're, reviewing things on a panel for 3 days next week. And if I send something during that time, it's not happening, even if I got it done. So if I think knowing a little bit more about the schedule especially would be helpful.
So I definitely keep that in mind moving forward.
So the second theme was more related to power dynamics and how students may choose to silence themselves essentially in response to these power dynamics. There may be some overlap with some of the other themes like related to masking because self-silencing, it has a lot to do with not speaking your truth, I guess. So we found that people were really hiding their struggles, not pushing back on scheduling demands or setting boundaries that would help them maybe prioritize their mental health a little bit more.
How was it unique? How was this experience unique for neurodiverse students?
So essentially, I think this theme of self-silencing, this is a concept that came originally from heterosexual relationships and how women can sometimes self-silence to keep stability in a relationship that's maybe not healthy, where they feel like they have less power. And so some researchers have also used this concept in education and found that, students sometimes will choose to not ask for help and then prioritize, the feelings of their teachers or their advisors in this case at their own expense. And so what we heard from students were that people were silencing themselves about especially the struggles that they were facing, and also not setting boundaries and really overdoing it. And I think that's obviously something that a lot of people experience in grad programs. There are a lot of demands placed on grad students, but our participants were kind of connecting it back to the need to hide their neurodiversity. So not admitting my struggles because I don't want to be perceived as disorganized or incapable. It's going back to that sense of like, I'm going to be subjected to whatever these power dynamics are that are going to take away my opportunity. And I need to keep my advisor happy at all times. Alexis, for example, said, I think for me, it's just, I don't know, struggling with the idea of not being able to be as honest about difficulties within the program, either like on a personal level or just things I don't agree with at the department level, because faculty members have power over my career and they have to write me letters for funding things or like if getting an internship or things like that. And so sometimes I approach other people and faculty members kind of in that same way, but like I've had to adjust how I talk to people who have a higher status than me. Yeah, I think it's just understanding that I can't say certain things that I really wish that I could say because they have a hold on my career and I want my degree and to do the things that I want to do. Someone else said, you feel like you're serving the administration and whoever you perceive as above you. And so you need to present yourself a certain way. And so again, that's like not telling how you're struggling with your work if you are, because you don't want to tell your boss or someone above you that you're struggling with the work or the academia or what have you. And that's really difficult, especially if you need help with something. So that they're just really feeling a lot of pressure to have an image of like having everything together and not setting boundaries and then overworking themselves.
I want you to make a call about like how advisors can help it. Does anything come to your mind immediately?
The only thing that really comes to mind quickly is talking about downtime and like how much work people are doing on the weekends or in the evenings, or if they need to take vacation. I don't think a lot of people encourage their grad students to take time to rest and recover and have a personal life.
Again, like my views have evolved through years, through interactions, and also some going through some maturation and gaining more experience. When I started as a young faculty member, first of all, and because of the insecurities, uncertainties involved in as an assistant professor, tenure track assistant professor, my ideal was to have students that they can work 24/7, honestly.
Yeah.
And I gradually came to, I never enforced it. Ideally, again, like subconsciously, what I was picturing as an ideal student was essentially a robot. Now that I look back, a robot can just function all the time, be fresh, creative, and energetic. I mean, all the time. Gradually, I started realizing that it was more of like not feedback from students. It was more of like understanding myself and how I function better. Is that we may achieve some level of pseudo productivity by working countless hours, but if we want to really serve a purpose here in academia, which is coming up with fresh, useful, impactful ideas, working like a factory worker is not necessarily the best approach. Downtime is very important. We need some days that are not productive. We need some boredom. We need some procrastination. Our brain is not an idea engine. It's not designed to on demand generate ideas. I mean, like, it's just a very complex way that it works. I mean, like, sometimes ideas just pop up on your mind, and sometimes, I mean, you intentionally try to kind of like come up with a solution, it doesn't work. So forming a better understanding of how our brain works and then planning or advising strategies around that. I'm not talking about the human aspect of it. I mean, like, I'm just saying, like, even if the purpose is just productivity, 24/7 just work may not actually get us where we want to go.
Yeah. And we heard a lot of students say things like, I can work 24/7 and still feel guilty, when I go to bed, feeling like I should have done more, right? And then connecting that to like not having time to take care of themselves or, exercise and sleep and just generally recover from the stress that they're going through.
Where you're just always behind when you're rushing to catch up. You're always like behind 5-6 tasks. The last thing you think about is, oh, how can I make sure that I eat healthy? So you just like eat the first thing that comes your way. I mean, like fast food even.
Right.
Like, I was a grad student. I remember that time that was the least priority. And the impact it has on your brain function, the detriment, is way worse than like just making sure that we write more pages. We can just generate writing, but like it's supposed to carry some ideas. I mean, like if it is empty of ideas, empty of like creativity, novelty, nice way of presentation, then essentially it's, I consider it pseudo productivity. We can just write pages and pages empty. So I don't know if you want to speak to that a little bit, how you feel about that yourself.
About food.
About food.
I mean, I personally am struggling really hard to plan healthy meals Granted, I also have a family. I have a family that has a lot of different food needs and preferences. And this is one of the things that I've really struggled with, because healthy meals that everyone likes takes a lot of
Yes.
advanced planning. And a lot of the time, I don't think about what we're having for dinner until like 4 o'clock. And people are like, oh, well, what's your plan for dinner? And I was like, I haven't had a chance to think about it yet. Right. So then I'm kind of rushing around trying to figure out, what do I have? What can I make? What can I pull together? Or if I'm just too exhausted, like, where can I buy dinner?
Yeah.
And I'm doing that far too often.
There are people who are listening to us and they understand that they have to pay more attention to it. But again, like, that is one more thing we are adding probably to their schedule already. And I suspect some of them are even like more anxious listening to this, because they're realizing that they should not put this at the bottom of their priority list. It's an interesting system. To survive it is requiring us to do some things that are counterproductive against the mission of the system. Even again, like, academia is supposed to be where creative ideas are generated. If you're not eating healthy, if you're not taking time to rest, recover, if you're not taking walks, if you're not having downtime, I mean, how can a person like that be creative? I mean, we have seen in movies or we have interacted with artists how freely they operate. They may not write a page for like 4 or 5 months, and then suddenly they start writing, or like they go to retreats. I mean, like, if you want to really write something that has value or generate ideas that are impactful, it cannot be accomplished just by spending more time in our offices. That's where I am in my profession, honestly.
There's something to that sense of like that persistent guilt. If I'm not producing something tangible at every given moment, I feel like I'm not doing enough. And I was thinking about this the other day, because sometimes you just need to read things, right? You need to like give yourself a bunch of input so that you can make connections in new ways, right? But when you're sitting around reading, it doesn't feel productive. Like, there's nothing tangible. What did I do? I thought about a bunch of things and I like put some ideas in my head, right? But then that's the seed of what's going to put the writing in a better place.
Yes.
It's just not going to happen right this second.
Sometimes, I mean, like, not even reading. I mean, sometimes you just need to listen to music and walk. Because when we are empty of ideas, we are empty of ideas. I mean, just pushing harder doesn't solve a problem. It just generates anxiety. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But I have that too, like that expectation somewhere is like in my head from somewhere.
That's true.
That I should be producing something tangible or physical all the time to show that I'm working, right? I should be writing an email, or I should be like working on some document, or I should be...
Subconsciously, there is just this demand that, am I writing enough proposals? Am I submitting enough proposals? So I'm thinking that, like, it is so cultural in academia. You have to always be productive, as defined by publishing, as defined by number of grants, as defined by the amount of money you bring, as defined by the number of students. It's just like always this endless race that you don't even get to celebrate any of the accomplishments. I don't know how sustainable it is. I mean, I'm thinking about the system. And, like, there are papers out there. I think one is Nature recently published that they are showing with data, very systematically they're analyzing the data and showing that academia is less creative today compared to 50 years ago.
So essentially, we heard from students that they were overworking, partly because of this, like, not being able to set boundaries. And also hearing from people who said that they felt like they needed more time to recover than neurotypical people. Whether it's, feeling more drained by social interactions that are happening all the time, or realizing that maybe you're working harder in some ways to compensate for some of your challenges, or, maybe it's that like regimented time thing where I'm trying to force myself to write for hours and hours and it's not happening. So I'm not like as efficient as I could be because I'm trying to force myself to work in a way that's not natural to me. And so I'm getting tired. I'm getting exhausted. So I like this one also from Wendy, and this is going back to that regimented time piece. Maybe I should skip this one since I already talked about it. Yeah, so like as I mentioned, Wendy, before talking about regimented time, she says, I will work until everything is done and everything is beautiful and wonderful and all of the things have been squared away and put where they belong and it's wonderful. And if I have to not sleep for 3 days to do that, that's what happens. I didn't get professionally diagnosed until I was 25 or 26, so I went through high school and college really frustrated all the time. I couldn't understand why I couldn't just work in regimented time. And then the flip side, so we see her working, work, no matter the cost. And then we hear also from Moira, who talks about taking on extra things because of imposter syndrome. She says, I think it also has to do with imposter syndrome and me thinking I have to take on all this stuff to prove that I'm capable and able to do that. I'm competent and can be successful. So sometimes I'll overload myself because of that. So there's almost a sense of like, I'm going to do as many things as I possibly can and maybe more just to prove that I belong here.
It goes back to the first theme
Right.
of acting normal.
Right.
I mean, I used to, even before I start doing research in this area, I used to say that I feel that I'm working 3 times harder. I always felt that. Demands are requiring me to work 3 times harder than my peers. And I didn't know why, but that was it. So I just had to do it.
Yep. And we definitely had people comparing themselves. So Jim said maybe it's not that way for neurotypical students. And Alexis, who is autistic, also said some people might be able to do that for long periods of time and maybe not experience burnout, but then other people might experience burnout more quickly with those things. But I think there's this expectation of like, you should just do X, Y, and Z and overload yourself and you'll be fine because everyone else has been fine doing that. But that would take me out longer, and I would need a longer period for recovering from that. And actually, I heard the phrase, it would take me out, or that took me out several times from different people. And kind of that phrase just really, I was like, what do you mean by that? What's an example of that? And it talks about typical grad school experiences to some extent, but then just really feeling like you've had every last bit of your energy sucked out.
Yeah.
And you just need to stop and rest and recharge. And like nothing's happening until you're done. Right?
And the cost of that is depression. If you deplete you overuse that energy over and over, it makes us way more vulnerable to depression.
Yeah, and physical health
And physical
issues as well. I mean, my first semester in grad school experienced a life-changing physical health problem that I'm sure was brought on by stress and overwork to some extent, right? And now I can feel it as a physical sensation when I know I'm overworking myself. I can feel it, and I force myself to just stop, even for a short while. And I just have to like stop and put my feet up and just rest and literally do nothing.
Some of our listeners may think that the only way to avoid something catastrophic, for example, unraveling of something, is to take a week off. Yet it may just need 30 minutes of walking or just listening to music, doing something useful. I thought it is a cool thing, and I'm really tapping into my superpower. I mean, like working 4 or 5 hours straight, and like I was even avoiding going to restroom and like not drinking as much water just because I wanted to just be hyper focused, and I was so proud of it at some point. Honestly, I'm talking about like 5-6 years ago that I can do that, and boy, it was unsustainable. Nowadays, I force myself by drinking actually a lot of water to stand up, walk for take a break. So maybe integration of simple things like that, maybe a reminder on your phone that every 2 hours reminds you that like go take a walk, even if it is not outside in the corridor. Get off the screen. I mean, not to check your social media. Get off the screen. I mean, that's very important. And I see a lot of students are doing that compared to my generation. Younger students are aware of the importance of that. But I suspect, I mean, like sometimes when things get close to deadline, we ignore the importance of that. Even if it is close to deadline, I think we still afford 5 minutes break.
How powerful it would be if faculty advisors could say those kind of things to their students and know that it was going to help, not hinder their productivity. You know what I mean? Like it seems like the concern is productivity, right?
Yeah.
So this culture around like I need to produce something at all times.
And particularly, again, like this burnout is a major thing. I mean, like we may be able to get through some difficult, intense periods, but at a cost.
And
again, like we're not more vulnerable. We don't get tired easier than like maybe neurotypical people, but because of the masking, because of like acting, because of so many other considerations we have to constantly keep in mind, and fear of judgment, and all of those things is just a lot more to process compared to someone who is just doing the task.
So I'm curious what your thoughts are about ADHD and masking, and like, have you seen that in your own experience, or what kind of ways does that manifest?
For me, it was my masking was more on my dyslexia side, making sure that if I have to write something on spot on the board, I mean, like I have checked the spelling of that thing. Sometimes, I mean, like reading something rather than like writing it on the board in front of my class. And at some point, it's like, just enough is enough. Honestly, I have to just tell my students I'm dyslexic. If I have problems, errors, I mean, like, you know what that means. I mean, like, for yourself, or don't correct it. I mean, you will know what it was supposed to mean when you read your notes. Masking for me was more on the dyslexia side of it. For ADHD, I tried to kind of like combine it with humor. My escape was through humor. I initiated like a joke. I mean, if I forgot something, I mean, like I tried to kind of soften the kind of atmosphere when it was possible, you know, when it was a safe environment to do that. Mm-hmm. And I afforded more and more. I didn't afford it as much before. I'm very open nowadays. Even, for example, when I participate in NSF panels, I make sure early on I tell them that I have dyslexia. So if I'm slow writing something, or, for example, reading aloud is not my strength. So I even ask if someone else can kindly write, for example, my panel summary, or read my panel summary, not writing my panel summary. And that really helps. Before that, I would say 50% of my intellectual bandwidth was occupied by the fear of, when we get to that point, am I going to embarrass myself or not, you know? So I think transparency is, but again, like, it's not a general suggestion, because we have to make sure that's a safe environment.
I mean, I was just thinking about my experience after getting my diagnosis with ADHD and having this conversation with you and with my other supervisor. And it took me 6 months to do it. And I had been thinking I'm in the safest environment possible, right?
So walk us through that, because I think that's
very weird.
Yeah,
that like I could know intellectually, like I'm in a spot where people are affirming and like have the strength-based perspective on neurodiversity, and like I had invested so much energy into appearing like I have everything all together all the time, and all my I's are dotted and my T's are crossed. My office space here was like spotless, because I would make sure to put everything away at the end of the day, so like no one could see my mess. Mm-hmm. Right. So, you know, whereas my home office is like stacks of everything everywhere, and I just move it so people don't see it. Mm-hmm. Right. So I'd invested a lot of energy into that image, I think. And so it was hard for me to have that conversation and say, I know you can't see it, but this is what's going on. And I'm really having a hard time, and I'm exhausted.
What was your fear?
I think I was scared of not being understood, or
even in this environment,
just because I hadn't been particularly forthcoming about how anxious I was all the time, trying to make sure I wasn't forgetting things, mm-hmm. or missing this, or when I sent my emails, I was reading them like 5 or 6 times to make sure that like the date I had put in there was correct, and like I was wasting so much of my time just like trying to look perfect all the time. And that's not sustainable, right? Because eventually something's going to crack.
And I remember the meeting that, it was an email you sent me first. You gave me a heads up and asked if we can meet to talk about something.
But looking back though, I think having that conversation was one of the biggest reliefs of my
Okay.
anxiety.
So
Like it was
it's very
so
important
helpful.
to tell us about that.
It was so helpful to have that conversation ultimately because I felt for the first time, like getting my diagnosis for the first time made me feel like I understood myself and felt like, okay, I know who I am and what's going on and like why I make decisions that I make and how, all of these things. But then having the conversation with you also allowed me to feel like I was being authentic for the first time. And that takes a lot of pressure off. So talking about like the amount of pressure I felt internally was relieved by being able to kind of like take that mask off. And then my anxiety dropped. And it
What
was
is your
partly, I think,
suggestion?
partly medication, but it was partly that too, because
What
being
is your
authentic
suggestion
is
to a student
so
who
helpful.
is in your position, is suspecting that they have, they fit the bill for one of these neurodiverse condition, and either they have a formal diagnosis or not, and they are not sure if it's a good idea to communicate that. Can you, and I know it should be done very, very carefully. They have to make sure that there is enough understanding, open-mindedness on the advisor side. We don't want to encourage anyone to go out and put themselves in like harm, because they really can lose opportunities by just exposing something that they could just survive without it. With some difficulty. What are the indications that they can look for on the advisor side to get a sense? Because you're very thoughtful. You think, I've noticed you pay careful attention to those nuances. So probably you can give us some ideas, like what are the things that they can pay attention to make a call at the end that is, if it is a safe environment.
I look for people who are willing to be honest about their own humanity too.
Interesting.
I think I also have kind of just a general like intuitive sense around people who feel comfortable and safe. But some of the indicators, I guess, would be people who are willing to admit that they've struggled in the past or that they've made a mistake. People who are willing to be honest about being human, being real,
That's very nice, actually, because I think it's actually is a very good indicator, as if a person wants to be perceived as perfect, has never admitted any mistake or anything. They're just the most perfect being created on the surface of the earth. Probably sharing something like that, the immediate reaction is, that's a you problem. That was actually a very good answer.
Thanks.
So that's maybe something that we can encourage the students to look for, even when they choose advisors. So maybe you can speak to that also. If they're early in their graduate education and they have a sense that things may not work, or they haven't yet formally chosen their advisor, what are the things that you encourage them to look for in choosing their advisors?
So I don't know if it's always possible to learn about your potential advisor's work style ahead of time. I'm not sure everyone has that same liberty to kind of develop a working relationship or even have those conversations. But I think if it's possible to learn about how your advisor or potential advisor operates on a daily basis, what kind of schedules do they keep? What kind of work style do they have? How do they work on their papers a month early, or they start working on it closer to the deadline? Like, how do they function? I think that's helpful to know. I don't know if it's possible to always know. And I think there are also some fields where you don't really have choices about who you choose because they're the only expert in that field.
Yeah.
So you don't always have that.
And I think students, they need to also pay attention not to just base their judgment on what other students, for example, if someone has a reputation for being rigorous, tough, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to have a bumpy relationship. Just being tough and rigorous, that doesn't, we are not encouraging students to go with the softer, most easygoing, advisors. That's not at all the case. Actually, that can be very, very frustrating for some students if they, based on the fear of, oh, I want an advisor that like never looks for something, or for example, like never asks me to do something quickly, gives me ultimate freedom, and that is not going to work out also.
Yeah, and you don't also necessarily want to have an advisor who's exactly like you, right? Because sometimes you need other things that your advisor can give you
That's interesting.
that you can't provide, right? We balance each other out sometimes. So maybe you need someone who is willing and able to like structure your time in a way that's helpful for you. Maybe it won't be helpful. You don't know necessarily until you get there, but I think compassionate people who are truly invested in your success and are willing to work with the talents that you bring, like those are all good things. So some flexibility in terms of like sometimes they might think you're going to be good at this one thing, and it turns out that's not your thing at all, but maybe you might have a different talent that is helpful in a different way, and being able to work with what you bring and use that as part of the project.
And communicating that is very important also. I've realized some of my students, it took me a year and a half until I realized that they are artists. And as soon as I realized that, it's like, oh, let's see how we can, not to integrate art into our engineering research, but like, for example, if you're a photographer, for example, then why don't we, for example, like include this digital image correlation like aspect in your like experiment? You know, if you're into that, you're excited about this, it has worked. But it was always like a random piece of information that I came to notice. It was never brought to me intentionally that, by the way, I'm good at this and this and this. So maybe I never asked what are like, I typically ask students like what your hobbies are, but like they may perceive things as irrelevant while they are relevant. Actually, it could be relevant or could be integrated into their graduate education. So I encourage students to have that conversation also. And again, like if they see just like a poker face, I mean, like, oh, good for you, you're an artist. I mean, like maybe the advisor is not seeing the person as a whole. I mean, like, you know what I mean? So maybe you have to pay attention to all of those things, you know?
I think that's a particular talent of yours, though. I think you tend to do that more than a lot of other people. Like, you look for the spark that people bring, and then you, like, actively try to use it.
Make it a fire.
Right? I think you do that. You know, I've been in other positions before where I was specifically not allowed to use my talent because I wasn't mastering a smaller skill that I wasn't interested in, right? And it was like, well, once you get past this, then you maybe learn how to do that other thing.
Do you know where
that's
it's
a
coming
waste.
from? It's coming from this arrogance that I know better how your brain works. It can be a very common problem that we think we understand students' brain better than them. We understand their interests. We understand what they have to be passionate about better than themselves. Rather than, as you said, I mean, what are those sparks? Where are they? How can we build on it? Again, going back to the idea of productivity, your whole self is going to be more productive compared to 30% of you. So if I can bring more of you, contribute to this research, it's better for everyone. And also in terms of sense of belonging, in terms of creativity, in terms of deep contribution to the work. If you're just here to write a draft, to say certain things, you're doing it just purely mechanically, you separate yourself 100% from that. Again, I got something like what a robot can produce probably at the end. And again, like these are things that we have to, on both sides, advisor and advisee, we have to pay more attention to. More diverse population of students that are coming to universities. That's a very good thing that's happening, but it's showing also how unequipped we are to really serve that diverse population. Although we talk about that all the time, but we are not equipped and we are not really that open-minded also most of the times.
And I think also students aren't aware that they should present themselves that way. Like, I think students are so familiar with being told all the things they're not good at, right? So if they go to talk to their advisor about, oh, I have ADHD, what are they going to say first? They're going to say, like, I'm not good at this or I'm not good at that, right? But are they going to say, I have a talent that, you know, allows me to go really deep into areas that I'm interested in, and I make really great connections between things, or like I'm a really big picture thinker. I like to do things that surprise people. I don't think students have kind of been like trained to recognize their talents and their strengths and to present that.
Yeah. It was really interesting to hear more about the inner working of your mind, and also how you have actually connected so deeply with the research you're doing. That I'm very happy to hear that I mean, it's very difficult now to separate you from your research. I mean, it's fully, I don't know if it's a good thing or bad thing, but you're living your research. So, Connie, we typically end the conversation by asking the guest what would be their advice to someone who is in, maybe you just can think of your 12, 13-year-old self and give her a piece of advice.
I think I would have benefited from a few pieces of advice, and one is to probably just be more honest and say the thing that you want to say. I think I struggled a lot with feeling like I wasn't being authentic for a long time.
You mean censoring yourself?
Yeah. And it's something that I've been giving myself permission to do, now in the work environment as an adult, right? Still feeling like policing myself. What if I'm going to say something irrelevant or something that's way off topic? Following that thought process, wherever it led you, is what's going to take the conversation into a different space where you're going to be creative, right? You're going to make different connections that they're not obvious. So I think I would have told myself to be more confident about saying the things that I was thinking and putting those out.
How about your college age self?
People are important. Connections are important. Okay. I know this is like not maybe
it's not you. Because I've never noticed that you ignore people.
Being more mindful about the connections that I was making or not making. I think one of the things I experienced as a young woman was a lack of mentorship. And so I was never encouraged to build relationships that I think would have benefited me in a lot of ways.
I've heard that some students, they find mentors outside the university, and particularly those that they do internship. I mean, like if they find someone that they can connect with, they make an arrangement so they can stay in contact even after the mentorship is over, the internship is over. Is it that like it's a very small population of students want to go to grad school? We rarely get questions about, tell me how your life looks like. I would love to share that experience, but again, I never felt that students are interested to hear about that.
I was given a lot of freedom, and I think the assumption was I would know what to do with that freedom. And I don't know that I did.
And there is something interesting. I mean, like I remember that age. I was confident that I know what I want, what I'm doing. Privilege that I had as a man in an engineering discipline, or did you have that sense?
Oh yeah, I'm making my own decisions and I'm doing this. I'm going to do this, but no one was like, "But have you considered this?" Or "You're really great at this. This is what you could do with it." Or why don't you talk to so and so about this path? No one was doing that. Or maybe they were, and I was too stubborn. I don't know.
Well, anyways, you're here, and we are so happy to have you. And again, I've told you multiple times that what future is going to bring for you is just like, it's going to surprise you. And it's going to surprise me also. I keep an open mind about that.
That's good. I like surprises.
There will be a lot of them for you.
Hopefully they're good ones.
All good ones. So thank you very much, Connie, again, for agreeing to do this and sharing your knowledge and wisdom with us. I appreciate that.
Thank you.